My parents hated me. I ran away from them. They sued me. When the trial was over, my stepbrother me and started me with brass knuckles. Hey Reddit. I've been reading a lot of posts here, and honestly, I didn't think I'd ever share my own story. But here I am, typing this out at 2 in the morning because, well, I can't sleep. I guess I just need to get it out of my head to make sense of it all. I don't even know if anyone will read this, but if you do, thanks for listening. It's not an easy story to tell, but here goes. I guess the best place to start is my childhood, though I'm not sure childhood is the right word for it. Childhood is supposed to be this time of innocence, of playfulness, of love, right? At least that's what I always heard. My reality was different. It's hard to explain what it feels like to grow up in a house where you're constantly walking on eggshells, where the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you fear the most. My parents were the kind of people who looked normal from the outside. They had jobs, they paid their bills, and we lived in a house that, to the neighbors, probably seemed like any other suburban home. But behind those closed doors, it was a different story. My dad, Thomas, was a walking storm. He could go from calm to violent in the blink of an eye, and you never knew when it was coming. He'd come home from work, toss his keys on the counter, grab a beer, and then it was a waiting game. If he was in a bad mood, which was most days, it was like living with a ticking time bomb. You just never knew when he'd go off. The thing is, he didn't always hit me. Sometimes, the verbal abuse was worse. He'd look at me with this sneer, this look of disgust, like I was the reason his life was so miserable. He'd tell me I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything, that I was lucky he even let me stay in his house. The first few times, I cried. But I learned pretty quickly that crying just made things worse. He'd call me weak, pathetic, and sometimes, if he was really angry, he'd make a move to hit me just to prove his point. And then there was my mom, Lisa. If you saw her out in public, you'd think she was a saint. She'd smile at the neighbors, make small talk with the cashiers at the grocery store, and she always kept the house spotless. But at home, when no one was watching, she was cold. Not in the same explosive way as my dad, but cold in a way that made me feel like I didn't even exist. She never hit me, not physically, but her words. I don't know if I'll ever forget some of the things she said. She'd tell me that I was a burden, that I ruined her life, that I was the reason she was stuck in this miserable existence. She'd say these things in this calm, almost casual voice, like she was commenting on the weather. And the worst part? I believed her. I learned pretty early on to keep my head down, to stay quiet. I'd get home from school and go straight to my room. I'd do my homework, read books, anything to stay out of their way. The less they noticed me, the better. There were days, though, when no matter how quiet I was, they'd find something to yell at me about. Maybe I left a dish in the sink, or maybe my grades weren't perfect. Whatever it was always my fault. And they made sure I knew it. School wasn't much of an escape either. I wasn't exactly popular. I was that weird, quiet kid who sat in the back of the classroom, hoping no one would notice me. And for the most part, they didn't. The other kids didn't pick on me, not really, but they didn't go out of their way to befriend me either. I was just there, invisible. I think the teachers noticed something was off, but no one ever said anything. Maybe they were too busy, or maybe they didn't want to get involved. Either way, I was on my own. Despite everything going on at home, I did well in school. I think I poured everything I had into my studies because it was the one thing I could control. I wasn't the smartest kid in the class, but I worked hard. I had to. I had this idea in my head that if I could just keep my grades up, if I could get into a good college, I could get out. I could leave that house and never look back. And somehow, I did it. I got accepted to a university a few hours away from home. It wasn't some fancy Ivy League school or anything, but it was far enough that I could finally breathe. I remember the day I left for college like it was yesterday. I didn't have much to pack, just a few clothes, some books, and my laptop. My dad didn't even come out to say goodbye. He just sat in his chair, staring at the TV, a beer in hand. My mom stood by the door, arms crossed, not saying a word. I don't think I even said goodbye. I just walked out the door and didn't look back. When I got to university, it was like stepping into a different world. I didn't have to worry about getting yelled at for no reason. I didn't have to tiptoe around, afraid of setting someone off. I could just exist. But it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. I'd spent so many years hiding, keeping my head down, that I didn't know how to be around people. I was still that quiet kid in the back of the room, except now, I was in a dorm full of loud, confident people who seemed to have their lives together. That's when I met Ryan. Ryan was the first person who really saw me. I don't know what it was about him, but he had this way of making you feel like you mattered. He wasn't pushy or loud like a lot of the other guys in our dorm, but he was confident. He had this calm energy about him, like nothing ever rattled him. We met during one of our first classes, and he sat next to me. I remember feeling nervous, like he was going to try to make small talk, and I'd have to pretend to be normal. But he didn't. He just nodded at me and introduced himself. That was it. No awkward small talk, no prying questions. Just, hey, I'm Ryan. Over the next few weeks, Ryan and I started hanging out more. He'd ask me to grab lunch, or come over to his room to play video games. At first, I kept my guard up. I wasn't used to people being nice to me without wanting something in return. But Ryan wasn't like that. He didn't ask too many questions about my life, and he didn't seem to care that I didn't talk much. He just accepted me as I was. For the first time in my life, I had a friend. As the months went by, Ryan and I became inseparable. We'd spend hours talking about anything and everything, or sometimes, we'd just sit in comfortable silence. I never told him about my home life, though. I didn't know how. I didn't want to see that look of pity in his eyes, the one I'd seen in people who had caught glimpses of my bruises when I was younger. I didn't want to be the broken kid in his eyes. But despite everything, life was good. I was doing well in my classes, and for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. I started to feel normal. Whatever normal meant, anyway. But, of course, things never stay good for long. Not in my life, at least. It was right after midterms when everything started to fall apart. I was walking back to my dorm one afternoon when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered it anyway. It was my mom. I hadn't heard from her since I left for college, so hearing her voice was a shock. She wasn't crying, but there was something off about the way she was talking. She said my dad had been in an accident. He was in the hospital, in a coma. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to feel relief. This was the man who had made my life a living hell for years. But there was another part of me, a small part, that felt something. Guilt, maybe. I don't know. My mom didn't ask me to come home, but I could hear it in her voice. She was alone, and she didn't know what to do. I didn't go home right away. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to face that house, to face them again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't focus on my classes, and every time my phone rang, my heart would race, wondering if it was her again, telling me he was dead. Ryan noticed something was off, but I didn't tell him what was going on. I didn't know how to explain it. A few days later, I got another call. This time, it was from the hospital. My dad had woken up, but he wasn't the same. They said he had some kind of brain damage. He wasn't responsive, and they didn't know how bad it was yet. My mom was frantic. She didn't know how to handle it, and she needed help. I told her I'd think about it and hung up. I spent the next few days in a fog. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I couldn't stop thinking about that house. That place that had been my prison for so many years. I could feel it pulling me back, like a black hole, and I didn't know how to stop it. I wanted to be free, but I didn't know how to cut those ties. Eventually, I broke down and told Ryan everything. I told him about the abuse, about the accident, about how I didn't know what to do. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just listened. And when I was done, he looked at me and said, "You don't owe them anything, G. You don't have to go back." I knew he was right. I didn't owe them anything. They'd never been there for me. Not really. But the guilt. It was like this weight pressing down on me, making it impossible to breathe. I felt trapped, caught between the life I wanted to leave behind and the person I was trying to become. For the next few weeks, I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into my classes, into hanging out with Ryan, into anything that would distract me from the gnawing feeling in my chest. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for a quiet moment to sneak back in. And then, one night, everything came crashing down. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when my phone buzzed. It was another unknown number, but this time, I knew who it was. I picked it up, And sure enough, it was my mom. She didn't say much, just that things were getting worse. My dad wasn't responding to treatment, and she didn't know how much longer she could handle it on her own. She asked me to come home. I don't know what came over me, but I hung up the phone and threw it across the room. I sat there in the dark, shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't go back. I wouldn't. But the guilt, it was suffocating. The next morning, I told Ryan I was leaving. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there, stuck in this limbo any longer. I needed to get away, to clear my head. I didn't expect him to offer to come with me, but he did. Without hesitation, he said, "Let's go." We packed our things and left that same day. We didn't even know where we were going. We just drove, leaving the city behind, leaving everything behind. We ended up in a small town a few hours away. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and it was far enough from everything that I felt like I could breathe again. We rented a cheap apartment, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had some control over my own future. I didn't have to answer to anyone. I didn't have to look over my shoulder, waiting for the next blow to come. But even though I was physically free, the memories, the trauma, they didn't just disappear. They lingered, like shadows, always there, always waiting. Ryan helped me through a lot of it. He never pushed me to talk, but he was there when I needed him. He became my anchor, the one constant in the chaos that was my life. We built a life in that town, or at least we tried to. I enrolled in a community college, trying to finish my degree, and Ryan found a job at a local restaurant. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than what I'd had before. It was a new beginning, or at least, that's what I told myself. But the past has a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you run. At this point, I'm going to stop here for now. I've already written more than I planned, but I feel like I've only scratched the surface. There's a lot more to tell, but I'll leave it for another time. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. Writing this down has helped more than I thought it would. I'm not sure what the future holds for me, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a say in it. Hey Reddit, I'm back. I didn't think I'd write again, but here I am. After pouring out the details of my childhood in the first part, I realized there was still so much left to tell. I've had a lot of time to think since then, and while the past always seems to creep back in, there's another side to my story that's just as important. It's about what came after I left that hellhole behind. How I tried to build something for myself, piece by piece, even when the odds were stacked against me. So, here's where I left off. Ryan and I had packed up and left everything behind. We had no real plan, no idea where we were going, but we drove for hours, leaving the city and its memories far behind us. We ended up in a small town, the kind of place where people notice if you're new, but they don't pry. We found a cheap, run-down apartment and settled in. It wasn't much, but it was ours. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had control, like I wasn't suffocating under someone else's thumb. But reality hits hard when you have no money, no job, and no connections. The savings I had left from student loans were barely enough to cover rent, and we knew we couldn't coast for long. It was time to grow up fast. Ryan, always the more charismatic of the two of us, landed a job quickly as a line cook at a local restaurant. He didn't love it, but he was good at it, and for a while it paid the bills. As for me, well, it took a little longer. I didn't have much work experience, outside of a few odd jobs during college, but I was determined. I applied everywhere, grocery stores, gas stations, even fast food joints. No one was hiring. For a while, it felt like the universe was playing one last cruel joke on me, like it wasn't enough that I'd survived my parents and the trauma they'd left me with. Now, I couldn't even find a way to make a living. Then, by some stroke of luck, I got an interview at a local marketing firm. It wasn't a big company, more like a mom-and-pop operation, but they were looking for someone entry-level, someone to do the grunt work. The pay wasn't great, but it was something. I remember sitting in the interview, my palms sweating as I tried to sell myself. I didn't have much to offer, just a decent GPA and a burning desire to prove that I could be more than what I'd come from. The owner, a middle-aged guy named Steve, seemed nice enough. He had this no-nonsense vibe about him, the kind of guy who built his business from the ground up. He didn't sugarcoat anything. "We're not looking for geniuses," he said bluntly. "We're looking for people who can work hard, take criticism, and improve. You think you can do that? I nodded, not trusting my voice. I'd learned to be good at taking criticism. Hell, I'd lived through years of it, most of it unwarranted. A job, even an entry-level one, felt like my ticket to something better. Steve hired me on the spot. The first few months were rough. The job was mostly administrative, sorting through emails, setting up meetings, proofreading reports. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't what I imagined myself doing after getting into college. But it was a start. I kept my head down and worked, just like I'd done all my life. But unlike before, there was room to grow here. Steve wasn't like my parents. He was tough, but fair. If I screwed up, he'd tell me, but he'd also tell me how to fix it. That was new for me. Ryan and I settled into a routine. He worked at the restaurant, and I worked at the firm. We'd meet up after our shifts, grab some takeout, and talk about our day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the first real stability I'd ever known. I wasn't constantly on edge, waiting for something to explode. I was living. After a year or so, things started to change. I got better at my job, started taking on more responsibilities. Steve noticed. He pulled me into his office one afternoon and told me I had potential. He said I was a fast learner, that I had a knack for understanding how people think and what they respond to. He gave me a chance to work on a small campaign for one of our clients, and to my surprise, it did well. The client was happy, and Steve gave me more opportunities. Before I knew it, I was no longer just the guy fetching coffee and scheduling meetings. I was part of the team, someone who mattered. Around that time, Ryan and I started talking about the future. We'd both been working dead-end jobs for long enough, and we were hungry for more. We'd spend late nights brainstorming, tossing around ideas for a business of our own. Ryan had always been entrepreneurial, and his mind was constantly buzzing with ideas. I, on the other hand, was more cautious. But the more we talked, the more the idea of starting something together started to make sense. We both hated the idea of working for other people for the rest of our lives. Ryan was burning out at the restaurant, and I could see the toll it was taking on him. And while I was growing at the firm, I knew I didn't want to be an employee forever. I wanted something that was mine. So, we decided to take the leap. The problem was, we didn't have a clue what kind of business we wanted to start. Ryan had some experience in hospitality, and I had my foot in the door in marketing, but combining those two things didn't feel right. So we started looking around, paying attention to what people in the town needed, what was missing. Eventually, we stumbled upon something. An idea that seemed almost too simple at first. The town we lived in was growing, but it lacked basic services, especially for small businesses. Most of the businesses in town were run by older folks, people who didn't know the first thing about how to market themselves in the digital age. That's where we saw our opportunity. We'd create a marketing and consulting business, specifically targeting small businesses that needed help transitioning into the digital world. We'd offer affordable, tailored solutions, something that big agencies didn't care about. It sounded easy on paper, but in reality, it was anything but. We pooled what little money we had, taking out loans and using every penny we'd saved. We rented a tiny office space in the back of an old building, barely big enough for the two of us. We spent hours researching, teaching ourselves how to build websites, run social media campaigns, and optimize SEO. Neither of us were experts, but we were determined. Ryan handled the sales side of things. He'd go out and talk to business owners, pitching our services. I handled the technical stuff, designing websites, creating content, and managing clients. At first, business was slow, really slow. We'd go days without a single call, and when we did get a client, they usually wanted everything for next to nothing. There were times when I wondered if we'd made a huge mistake. We were barely making enough to cover rent, and we weren't pulling in enough clients to justify quitting our day jobs. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was just another one of my failed attempts at escaping the past. But Ryan wouldn't give up. He believed in the business, even when I didn't. He kept pushing, kept networking, and slowly, things started to change. We landed a few bigger clients, businesses that had been around for decades but had no idea how to reach new customers in the digital age. They were skeptical at first, but once they saw results, word started to spread. We started getting more clients, and suddenly, we were busy. Really busy. We hired our first employee, a young woman named Jessica, to help with client management and administrative work. She was a godsend, always on top of things, and she helped free up my time so I could focus on the creative side of the business. Ryan and I were working 12-hour days, sometimes more, but it felt different now. We were building something real. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. We hit a lot of bumps along the way. There were months when we barely made enough to pay ourselves, let alone our bills. We had clients who refused to pay, contracts that fell through, and competitors who tried to undercut us at every turn. There were days when I wanted to throw in the towel, but every time I thought about giving up, I remembered what I was running from. I wasn't just trying to build a business, I was trying to build a life, a future that wasn't defined by the trauma of my past. One of the most shocking moments came about a year into the business. We had landed a huge client, a chain of local restaurants that wanted a full rebranding and digital overhaul. This was the kind of client that could make or break us. If we pulled it off, it would take us to the next level. If we failed, well, we didn't want to think about that. Everything was going well at first. The restaurant chain loved our ideas, and we were on track to deliver everything on time. But then, out of nowhere, disaster struck. One of our freelancers, a guy we'd hired to help with the web development side of things, disappeared. He had been handling a crucial part of the project, and with the deadline looming, we had no idea where he was. Calls went unanswered, emails bounced back, and his social media went dark. We were screwed. Ryan and I scrambled to pick up the pieces. We stayed up for 3 days straight, trying to finish the work ourselves. I don't think I've ever been that stressed in my life. I was running on fumes, barely able to keep my eyes open, but we couldn't afford to lose this client. Somehow, by some miracle, we managed to pull it off. We delivered the project on time, and the client was thrilled. But that experience shook me to my core. It made me realize just how fragile everything we'd built was. One misstep, one bad hire, and it could all come crashing down. After that, we tightened things up. We stopped outsourcing as much and focused on building a solid in-house team. Jessica took on more responsibility, and we hired a few more people to handle the workload. Slowly but surely, we grew. We moved into a bigger office, signed more clients, and started making a name for ourselves. But success came at a cost. Ryan and I were working ourselves to the bone, and the stress started to take its toll. We were constantly arguing about clients, about money, about the direction of the business. There were times when I thought our friendship wouldn't survive. We'd been through so much together, but the pressure of running a business was pushing us to our limits. Things came to a head one night after a particularly brutal argument. Ryan had been pushing for us to expand, to take on more clients and hire more staff. I, on the other hand, wanted to play it safe. I was terrified of losing everything we'd worked for. The argument got heated, and before I knew it, we were shouting at each other. Ryan stormed out of the office, and I didn't hear from him for days. I thought that was it. I thought I'd lost my best friend, my business partner, the person who had been there for me through everything. But then, out of the blue, Ryan showed up at my apartment. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down on the couch and stared at the floor. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry, man. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose us." I didn't say anything, but I knew what he meant. We'd been through hell together, and we weren't going to let a business come between us. We worked it out. We made a plan. We'd grow, but we'd do it smartly. No more rushing into things. No more letting the business consume us. From that point on, things got better. We found a balance. We hired the right people, took on the right clients, and stopped chasing every opportunity that came our way. And slowly, our business became a success. A real success. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far we've come. We went from two broke guys with no plan to running a thriving business. We're not millionaires, not by a long shot, but we've built something we're proud of. Something that's ours. And me? I'm still trying to figure out who I am in all of this. The past is still there, lurking in the shadows, but I'm learning how to live with it. I'm learning how to move forward, how to build a life that's not defined by where I came from. There's still a long way to go, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm on the right path. I think that's enough for now, Reddit. I'm sure there's more to tell, and maybe I'll get to it one day. But for now, thanks for listening. Writing this out has helped more than I thought it would. If you're going through something similar, if you're stuck in a place that feels impossible to escape, just know that there's always a way out. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight, but it's possible. You can build something better for yourself. You can rise above the ashes. Hey Reddit, I'm back again, and if you thought my life was complicated before, buckle up. I thought I had left all the chaos behind when I built my business and finally created something of my own. But it turns out that when you try to escape your past, sometimes it follows you in ways you never expect. This post is going to be long, and it's going to be crazy, but it's also the truth. So here's what happened. A few months after Ryan and I had finally stabilized our business, we were growing faster than we ever imagined. The digital marketing company we built was gaining clients left and right, and we had just hired a few more people to keep up with the demand. It was the kind of success that seemed unreal, like something I never thought I could achieve coming from where I did. But, of course, just when things seemed to be going well, the past came knocking. It all started with an unexpected phone call. I was in the middle of a meeting with Ryan, discussing a potential new partnership, when my assistant knocked on the door. Hey, gee, sorry to interrupt, but there's a man and a woman in the lobby who say they're your parents. I froze. I hadn't heard from my parents, Thomas and Lisa, in years, not since I left for university. As far as I was concerned, they were out of my life, and I wanted to keep it that way. My assistant looked at me, clearly uncomfortable. Should I tell them you're unavailable? But something in me snapped, and I found myself saying, no, send them up. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the hope that they'd finally come to apologize for everything. Or maybe I just wanted closure. They walked into my office like they owned the place. My dad, Thomas, was dressed in his usual worn-out jeans and a flannel shirt, but there was something different about him. He had this swagger, this sense of entitlement that made my skin crawl. My mom, Lisa, was as cold and sharp as ever, her eyes darting around the office as if she were already measuring it for curtains. Ryan stayed, sitting quietly next to me, watching everything unfold. What are you doing here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The last thing I wanted was to show them any weakness. We came to talk about your business, my mom said, her voice as smooth and calculated as I remembered. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries. My dad nodded. We heard you've done well for yourself. I clenched my fists under the desk. Of course, they weren't here to reconnect. They wanted something. This business is mine, I said. It has nothing to do with you. My dad chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. That's where you're wrong, son. You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for us. The audacity of that statement hit me like a punch to the gut. After everything they'd done, after all the years of abuse, neglect, and trauma, they had the nerve to claim that they were somehow responsible for my success? My mom stepped forward, her gaze icy. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We sacrificed for you. Now it's time for you to give back. I shook my head, disbelief flooding through me. Sacrificed? You didn't sacrifice anything for me. You abused me. You made my life hell. I owe you nothing. My dad's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't talk to your father like that. But I wasn't that scared kid anymore. Get out, I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. You're not getting a penny from me. My mom didn't flinch. She smiled, a cold, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. We'll see about that. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. They turned and walked out of my office as if they'd already won. I stood there, shaking with anger, trying to process what had just happened. Ryan came up beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. You okay, man? I nodded, but inside, I was anything but okay. I knew they weren't bluffing. They were going to try to take everything from me. True to their word, a week later, I was served with legal papers. My parents were suing me for emotional damages, claiming that I had abandoned them after everything they had done for me. They were demanding a percentage of my business, arguing that without their support, I never would have succeeded. It was absurd. The whole lawsuit was built on lies, and yet here I was, facing the possibility of losing everything I had worked for. I hired the best lawyer I could find, a sharp woman named Caroline who had a reputation for being ruthless in court. She took one look at the case and assured me that we could win, but it wasn't going to be easy. The trial was a nightmare. My parents stood up in front of the court and painted this picture of themselves as the loving, supportive parents who had given up everything for their son, only for him to turn his back on them. My dad played the role of the hardworking, broken man, while my mom, ever the actress, cried about how I had abandoned them in their time of need. I sat there, seething, listening to them twist reality beyond recognition. They talked about how they had paid for my education, a lie, how they had always encouraged me to follow my dreams, another lie, and how devastated they were when I cut them out of my life. The worst part was when they brought in my stepbrother, Scott. I hadn't seen him in years. He'd moved out when I was still young, and we never had much of a relationship. But now, there he was, standing in court, backing up their lies. He told the court how he had watched me turn into a cold, ungrateful man who cared about nothing but money. It was a circus, and I felt trapped in the middle of it. But Caroline was incredible. She tore their case apart piece by piece, exposing every lie, every contradiction. She brought in evidence of the abuse I had suffered, testimonies from people who had known me growing up, and even old police records from the few times I tried to escape them as a teenager. By the end of it, the judge had seen enough. He ruled in my favor, dismissing the case and ordering my parents to cover all legal fees. It was a huge victory, but I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt exhausted. My parents left the courtroom in silence, their faces twisted in anger. Scott shot me a look of pure hatred as they walked out, but I didn't care. I thought that was the last I'd ever see of them. I was wrong. A couple of months went by, and things started to get back to normal. The business was doing well, and Ryan and I were finally able to relax a little. I tried to put the whole ordeal behind me, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that it wasn't over. I should have trusted that instinct. It happened late one night. I had stayed at the office later than usual, catching up on some paperwork while Ryan had already gone home. The streets were quiet, and the building was almost empty. I packed up my things and headed for the parking lot, my mind already drifting to what I'd do when I got home. Maybe grab some takeout, watch a movie, just unwind. I didn't hear him coming. I was halfway to my car when something slammed into me from behind, knocking me to the ground. Pain exploded through my back as I hit the pavement, and I rolled over just in time to see Scott standing over me, his face twisted with rage. "Get up," he snarled, pulling something out of his pocket. My heart dropped when I saw the gleam of steel in his hand. Brass knuckles. "Scott, what the hell are you doing?" I gasped, struggling to my feet. My ribs ached from the fall, and fear shot through me. He looked unhinged, wild, like a man on the edge of losing control. "You think you can just walk away? You think you can ruin my life and get away with it?" he shouted, advancing on me. I backed up, my hands raised. "I didn't ruin your life, Scott. This isn't my fault. What are you talking about?" He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You ran away, G. You left us to deal with everything. I had to pick up the pieces after you bailed. They blamed me for everything. I had to stay with them. I had to listen to their bullshit while you got out clean." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "Scott, I didn't." But before I could finish, he lunged at me. I tried to dodge, but he was faster than I expected. His fist, wrapped in steel, connected with my jaw, and I saw stars. The force of the blow sent me staggering back, and before I could recover, he hit me again, this time in the ribs. I felt something crack, and I dropped to one knee, gasping for breath. He stood over me, panting, his face twisted in rage. "You took everything from me," he growled. "You got out, you built this fucking business, and now you think you're better than us." I spat blood onto the pavement, my vision swimming. "I never wanted this," I choked out. "I just wanted to be free." "Bullshit," he shouted, raising his fist again. But this time, I was ready. I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. We hit the pavement hard, and the brass knuckles slipped from his hand. I grabbed them and threw them as far as I could, then scrambled to my feet. My ribs were screaming in pain, but I couldn't stop now. Scott got up, breathing heavily, his eyes wild. "You think you can beat me?" he hissed. "I don't want to fight you, Scott," I said, backing away. "Just walk away." But he didn't. He charged at me again, and this time I was ready. I sidestepped his attack and landed a solid punch to his side. He grunted in pain, but he didn't stop. He swung at me again, his fist connecting with my shoulder, sending a shock of pain down my arm. We fought like that for what felt like hours, two brothers locked in a brutal, desperate struggle. Neither of us willing to back down, neither of us willing to let go of the rage that had been simmering for years. Finally, I managed to land a solid blow to his stomach, and he doubled over, gasping for breath. I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall, pinning him there. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Just stop." For a moment, he struggled, his fist still clenched, but then something in him seemed to break. His shoulders slumped, and he stopped fighting. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his face twisted in pain. "I didn't want this, Scott," I said, my voice low. "I never wanted any of this." He didn't respond. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, resentment, maybe even regret. And then, without another word, he pushed me away and walked off into the night. I stood there, panting, my body aching, watching him disappear into the darkness. For a long time, I just stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't know if I'd ever see Scott again, or if this was the end of whatever twisted relationship we had. But one thing was clear. I wasn't the scared, helpless kid I used to be. The police came, and I filed a report. They tried to track Scott down, but he was gone, just like my parents had been after the court case. For now, at least, they were out of my life again. It's been a few months since the attack, and I'm still healing, physically and emotionally. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm determined to keep moving forward. Ryan's been my rock through all of this, and the business is stronger than ever. We're even talking about expanding, maybe opening a second office in another city. But no matter how much success I find, no matter how far I go, I know the past will always be there, lurking in the shadows. It's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. But at least now, I know I can handle it. I know I'm strong enough to face whatever comes my way. So yeah, that's my story. If you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with me. Writing this out has helped more than I thought it would. Maybe one day, I'll be able to put all of this behind me for good. But for now, I'm just taking things one day at a time.